He was the quiet teacher whose insight molded a generation and the center of the karate child's heart. However, Pat Morita's journey was anything from serene behind the scenes. The guy who made Mr. Miyagi come to life finally spoke up before he died, sharing the truth about what actually happened on filming. It was more than just crane postures, kicks, and lines. It was about wars that were never captured on camera. Why did he hold on to that fact for so long, and why did he hold it till the very end? Miyagi was facing the wall. Mr. Miyagi, the quiet handyman with a wise gaze, clipped words, and a gentle strength that got Daniel LaRusso through his most trying times, is the first person that comes to mind when people think of the Karate Child. However, the majority of fans were unaware that the guy who became Miyagi hardly ever had the opportunity until Pat Morita himself spoke out years later. In actuality, one of Hollywood's most influential voices at the time was adamant about preventing him from playing the part at all. Most people had known Pat Morita as a comedian. His humorous television appearances, snappy one-liners, and easy timing of his humor were what audiences remembered about him. Because of his record, he was seen by many executives as the last person who could represent a mentor who was emotionally damaged and war-hardened. Morita's name crossed the room during the initial casting sessions for the role of Mr. Miyagi, but producer Jerry Weintraub swatted it away. A prominent player in the industry, Weintraub, is said to have yelled that he didn't want a comedian near this section. He desired a heavyweight with gravitas, someone who could convince viewers that he was a guy who silently bore both grief and knowledge. That was the wall, and it remained solid for weeks. Each time Weintraub saw Morita's name on a list, he turned it down. He believed that there were many actors in America who would be more suitable for the role. The casting directors and producers looked everywhere else, looking through headshots and calling in players who sounded and looked like the part, or at least had the background Weintraub desired. Not even given a chance to read, Pat Morita. But this is where everything started to go wrong. Having demonstrated his ability to spot underdog stories with Rocky, director John Avildsen had no interest in going down the same old route. He realized that more than just fighting and training montages were necessary for the Karate Kid to succeed. It requires a connection between the learner and the mentor. He wanted to investigate every possibility since that felt genuine and human. Regardless of Weintraub's approval, Avildsen demanded that all potential candidates be read. Later, Pat Morita would think about how strange it was. He was practically an afterthought, the last performer brought in when his turn came. He was also aware of the irony. Because the director persisted, the actor who had been so flatly rejected by the producer was now being viewed. That instant. This was more than simply an audition for an actor whose career had been reduced to years of alternating between stand-up performances and modest TV roles. It was an unanticipated opportunity at a role that everyone else seemed determined to deny him. For Morita, it demonstrated the unpredictability of Hollywood, where rejection may subtly lead to a new opportunity the following day. In the past, when Miyagi was so popular, many could have forgotten that there had once been a brief period of intense anxiety during casting discussions. But Morita would always remember it. Later in life, he publicly discussed the near-death experience Weintraub's camp had with the project before it had even begun. Morita attributed the transformation of his entire career to John Avildsen's sheer persistence. This reveals more than just another conflict behind closed doors. It demonstrates how brittle the process of creating movie legends can be. The difference was made by a single executive's indifference and a single producer's snap decision. Morita might not have gone into the audition room if Avildsen hadn't been firm. And the story we all knew about the Karate Child would be different without Morita. In his artistic pursuits, the wall he eventually encountered would prove to be intractable. As Pat would sardonically argue over the years, walls should be scaled or cut through. Shortly afterwards, he found himself on a completely different stage, yet not a single person in the audience could even remotely connect with the polished clown they had seen. Because it wasn't the polished comic from TV who entered that audition room. He was a weary, bearded man who had just arrived from Hawaii. He could hardly recognize the person in the mirror. Hawaii, fate, and beard. Pat Morita's career was veering into uncharted territory by the early 1980s. From comedies like Happy Days to stand-up clubs, he had already had the taste of stardom, But the offers had slowed and the limelight seemed to be evaporating. He ended himself in Hawaii, making a livelihood from whatever job came his way, rather than pursuing roles in Hollywood. Performing in nightclubs, writing content for advertisements, and emceeing political fundraisers. Although it wasn't stable or flashy, it was enough to pay the expenses. From the outside, Morita's career appeared to be slowly waning. He felt as though he was waiting for something invisible, treading water. Then he made a choice that fundamentally altered his reputation. He allowed his hair and beard to grow out for the first time in his life and not for a part. Just because he wanted to attempt something new, not for a show. He looked more like a hippie than an actor, Pat later remarked with laughter. He didn't care at the time, though. He wasn't concerned with looking camera-ready or pursuing casting directors. He was just living his life, allowing his appearance to be a reflection of the less polished and uncertain chapter he was in. Scruffy's odd beard would turn out to be a lucky break. Unbeknownst to him at the time, that appearance contributed to giving the impression that he was a tough guy who had experienced adversity when he eventually got the chance to try out for the Karate Kid. Compared to the comedian audiences were accustomed to seeing, it gave him an older, wiser, and more grounded appearance. What began as a personal decision quickly turned into an unforeseen gift for his career. Pat had long come to terms with the fact that his life had become about silence. Actually, he considered letting his agent's contract expire when it came up. However, he changed his mind and was giving his agency a rather grudging reappointment. What on earth? He was therefore prepared to return to Hawaii after leaving his agent's office one afternoon, certain that no jobs were waiting for him. At this point, fate stepped in with a booming yell. From above, a booming voice had roared. Pat Morita! Shouting that he had just left the office, the secretary rushed out. The agent leant out and gave him a frantic wave in return. Get your ass back in here, Pat. I believe there is a script that would be ideal for you. The Karate Kid was the script. It's the sort of tale that Hollywood appears to find too tidy. Someone should write a Destiny movie. It was more of a weird moment, Morita later said. Standing there with one foot out, he accepted that nothing awaited him here and waited to leave Los Angeles. Then the script fell on him, almost like a last-minute interception. He perused it. It pleased him. He consented to John Avildsen's audition. It didn't feel like a life-altering event at that moment, it was just another room, another director, or a chance. However, a bigger plan started to emerge as a result of the timing, the beard, and the happenstance of being brought back in the door at that precise moment. In retrospect, when Morita discussed this occurrence, he did so with awe, considering that maybe an unseen hand had guided him back towards his intended path. He wouldn't have resembled Miyagi if he hadn't been in Hawaii. There wouldn't have been a script for anyone to show him if he hadn't quit with his agent. He may have been overlooked by luck if he hadn't shuffled his feet on the sidewalk that day. A single open door resulted from all those small choices, mishaps, and detours. To try out for a part that the producers had never asked him to read for, and when he eventually entered the audition room, he didn't see a panel of judges or a table of executives. One man was attached to a camera, and the camera was observing him. Pat Morita anticipated the typical Hollywood setup when he was given the opportunity to read for the Karate Kid. A producer, a casting assistant, someone taking notes, and possibly a writer in the corner. Everyone is eager to evaluate whatever he says. Rather, he entered a practically deserted room and immediately entered one of the most peculiar auditions of his professional life. John Avildsen, the director who had already made his mark on movie history with Rocky, was seated there. But Avildsen wasn't flipping through a script or lounging at a desk. He was part machine and half man. He held a camera on one side of himself. In contrast, he wore the heavy battery pack strapped to his chest. Despite his cordial introduction, he never lowered the camera. Morita was being filmed as soon as he intervened. Morita would later quip that he initially thought of Avildsen as a half-man, half-recording equipment, and half-director. But there was a serious lesson hidden beneath the humor. Avildsen was looking for more than a well-written text. When no one else thought Pat could be Miyagi, he wanted to record the man's unadulterated presence to see if he could. Still looking through the glass, Avildsen added, tell me a little about yourself. Pat then talked about his life, profession, and highs and lows rather than reciting prepared phrases. He wasn't auditioning in the conventional sense at the time. He was providing a glimpse of his true self. Abelson continued to tumble. The script then appeared. For the most difficult scenes, those that hadn't been planned, choreographed, or anything else for that matter, Pat wasn't going to recite a few safe lines. Without any sets, he improvised and lent into the emotional weight of his role as Miyagi. Outfits or a different performer to portray. He only anticipated a courteous thank you and dismissal when he was done. Rather, Avilson asked, "Pat, would you mind taking your script with you?" as he began to leave. "You may require it." It was an electrifying sentence. For the first time, Morita felt as though he had finally pierced the barrier of uncertainty that surrounded him. He had entered as a bearded comic. He left as someone who, in spite of all the odds, might have become Mr. Miyagi. The decision had already been taken by Avildsen. He would play that footage again later in meetings when the producers were debating potential casting decisions. He once simply clicked on the monitor during a contentious debate while they were in production. When Morita's audition popped up on the screen, the meeting became silent. Then, the same Weintraub who had rejected him outright said, "Hey, hold on a second. It appears to be Miyagi." "That's the Pat Morita you refused to read for the part," Avildsen said calmly as he turned. Morita's ability to act was confirmed by the tape. In a manner that no one else could. It confirmed that he was Miyagi. The crack was the cause. That began to weaken the barrier wall. Naturally, Hollywood isn't the type to give up anything easily. Morita was often called back, even when Abelson's footage was remarkable. They wanted to be certain since they were producers. Would he be able to do it again? Could he dress up to do it? Is he going to be able to compete with Ralph Macchio? Morita came through. Once more. The doubt gradually faded. However, it all began with that one camera test, in which Pat Morita was subjected to the watchful eyes of a filmmaker who firmly believed in capturing the truth on film, rather than a panel of skeptics. The exams would soon be about more than simply him. To examine if a genuine connection could form between a pupil and a teacher, they would pair him with a young actor from New York. 1 chemistry, 5 tests. Most performers may land a role with just one strong audition. It took 5 for Pat Morita. The producers demanded more even after John Avildsen's tape convinced doubters. They had to be sure that the man they had written off as a comedian could truly represent Mr. Miyagi. Thus started a demanding series of tests, 5 distinct sessions intended to demonstrate whether Pat Morita could not only play the role but also embody it. Simple reenactments comprised the first 2 tests. Would he be able to replicate the same nuance and passion as his first audition? Would he be able to draw on Miyagi's subdued authority without resorting to comedy or parody? At every delivery, Morita spoke with weight, held himself with dignity, and shown moments of vulnerability that alluded to Miyagi's more profound tale. However, the stakes were upped in the 3rd test. Ralph Macchio flew in from New York this time. Could Daniel LaRusso and Mr. Miyagi's chemistry feel genuine? That was what the producers needed to know. More than just a teacher-student relationship was required by the screenplay. It was mentor and guide, father and son. Without a connection between Morita and Macchio, the whole movie would fall apart. At first, they would read aloud. Simple conversations only. After that, there are dramatic elements, such as complete, soul-bearing admissions, moments of waxing on and off, and empty silences that speak more than words. Morita's bond with Macchio was not even the source of the imparted seriousness. Instead, it was his response, which was warm and naturally flowing. He paid attention. He responded. He led. And slowly, as if he were someone he could trust, Macchio lent into him. To underpin the entire franchise, that would be the first sign of a collaboration. Before making a commitment, the producers required more information, even though they could see it. Costumes were added for the 4th test. Could Morita possibly resemble it? He underwent a complete transformation in a pretty basic GE, with his hair and beard serving as features. The sitcom regular or nightclub comedian was no more. He was replaced by a man shaped by time, experience, and silent suffering. Later, even Ralph acknowledged that the change was shocking when Pat dressed as Miyagi. He seemed to transform into a character. However, studio executives ultimately desired assurances beyond assurances. The decisive test was the fifth and last one. On a Chile, deserted soundstage, they demanded a reading. Just Morita, Macchio, and the camera, no sets, no props. In terms of stress testing, it was the best. Even in the most dire circumstances, was magic still possible? The response came quickly. The way the two communicated was as natural as breathing. Morita remained silent. He lived in Miyagi. Lines were not delivered by Macchio. He was answering a very real-seeming mentor. There was a deafening silence as the camera stopped. In addition to demonstrating his acting prowess, 5 auditions demonstrated his Miyagi identity in a manner that no one else could equal. Although it had been a difficult experience, it produced something enduring. Pat Morita and Ralph Macchio were no longer co-stars after that. A synergy that spanned centuries united Ralph and Pat to become Daniel and Miyagi. Morita was identified as Miyagi by the 5 perfect tests, but the hardest skeptic's phone call was the final straw that put an end to his chances. The call that turned the room upside down. One shadow remained after Pat Morita eventually made it through the ordeal of screen tests, chemistry reads, and auditions. Weintraub, Jerry. The formidable producer had been the barrier that almost prevented Morita from joining the Karate Kid. He was against a comic playing the part. He didn't think Pat could carry the gravity and weight of a mentor. Morita's future had hovered on the brink of Weintraub's uncertainty for weeks. The phone call that turned the room upside down then arrived. Following the 6th test, Morita and Ralph Macchio performed in front of the studio executives while dressed in costume. The scenario lacked sweeping music and karate kicks. It was a silent conversation. Miyagi talking to Daniel in the slow, clipped tone Pat had developed out of instinct and fatigue. Daniel responded as a young man relying on the knowledge of a person who appeared to care, rather than as an actress reciting lines. Its silence was more powerful than any action scene could ever be. As assured as ever, Avildsen. Start the camera. From the start, he had stood up for Morita, defending his inclusion, circulating his clip, and playing the video whenever Weintraub became contemptuous. Now, Morita and Macchio were indisputable in front of a packed room. There was stillness at the end of the test, a silence so profound that it tipped the scales, instead of skepticism or laughing. Weintraub answered the telephone. Morita was waiting at home on the other end, still uncertain if the part he had thrown himself into would disappear. Words were not wasted by Weintraub. His normally piercing and uncompromising speech now had a different tone. "I nearly made the worst mistake of my life, Pat," he said. "I would like to congratulate you initially. You possess the aspect of Miyagi Morita who desired that position for her own atonement. Not a comedian, not Morita, declaring to the world in complete defiance. Now it was his opponent who had to take back what he had said. The entire balance of power in the production changed with a single phone call. The room that had earlier denigrated him was now bowing its head. Pat would describe his feelings as humility and triumph. Simultaneously. He hadn't boasted, yelled, or mentioned how close they were to excluding him. He had just embraced the responsibility with an inner sense of pride. He was aware that the significance of this triumph extended far beyond his professional life. Miyagi was more than just a fictional figure. He was certain to become a cultural figure. It was more of a turning point for the movie than it was for Morita. Because of Miyagi's co-casting, production was hampered. John Avildsen was Ralph Macchio's mentor by heart. In addition, Jerry Weintraub had the courage to own up to his mistakes. Because it was difficult, Pat's success was even sweeter. The portion was not given to him. He struggled through a great deal of uncertainty. With Weintraub's words echoing in his ears, he could now put on Mr. Miyagi's shoes for the first time with all the strength his value could summon. The parts were safe, But Pat Morita's fight was far from over. Convincing viewers that Miyagi's terrible English was poetry rather than comedy presented a fresh hurdle for him once the cameras began to roll. The origin of Miyagi's voice. One accomplishment was securing Mr. Miyagi's part. Another was giving Miyagi a voice that would live on in history. Pat Morita was aware that the character may be made or broken by Miyagi's speech. The voice ran the risk of becoming stereotypical if it veered too much towards caricature, which is another generalization Hollywood frequently applied to Asian characters. It wouldn't fit the script's portrayal of an immigrant janitor and war veteran rooted in fragmented English rhythms acquired in later life if it were overly clean and polished. Morita needed to strike a balance between sincerity and dignity. Ironically, fatigue was the initial spark. Morita was worn out with the protracted process of establishing himself during his initial tryouts. His sentences slowed as his energy level dropped, slipping into hesitant, clipped sentences. Morita further clarified with a wry smile that this is the reason Miyagi speaks in this manner. There was no plan. When he lacked the strength to overthink, it was just what came out. But there was something about it that Avildsen and others saw. It wasn't a clownish cadence. It wasn't coerced. It was heavy. It seemed authentic to Miyagi's past. Nevertheless, Morita meticulously polished it. He embraced the notion of a man who spoke slowly and purposefully, who had studied English as a second language but who gave each word careful attention. The poor grammar was transformed into a form of poetry rather than a flaw. Miyagi informs Daniel that a man who uses chopsticks to capture flies may achieve anything, and it lands as a bit of ancient knowledge rather than a joke. People leant forward and listened more intently because of the rhythm, as though each silence had significance. According to Ralph Macchio, the voice initially disarmed him. He was aware that Morita was a quick-witted comedian. All of a sudden, though, the contrast was magical. He was speaking to someone else, quietly, almost meditatively, and his words were falling into the water like little stones. While Miyagi subdued the atmosphere around him with brief, broken English, Daniel was brimming with nervous energy and making mistakes in his sentences. There was a wonderful balance between the two rhythms. Naturally, there were still some concerned people in the studio. Was this excessive? Would viewers be amused in the wrong ways? Morita was also concerned. He was aware that accents have long been used to denigrate people in Hollywood, not raise. However, he believed that Miyagi would transcend caricature if he gave him dignity and spoke from the heart rather than through parody. And he was right. Instead of serving as a joke, Miyagi's speech became a component of his charm, humor, and compassion. Disenfranchised above his voice, it naturally enjoyed a smooth, nearly song-like continuance off-screen, away from the stiff, halting Miyagi speech. When this disparity was revealed about him in later interviews, many admirers were shocked. They found it hard to believe. With his halting, fractured staccato, the polished, clever man who was telling them stories and experiences must have been the same one who said, wax on, wax off. But Morita's artistry was that. He made a mask. A performance that was so authentic that it blended in perfectly with the wearer. The accent grew smaller than that voice. It developed into a character unto itself. Children made impacts. The adults recalled it. Comedians made fun of it. However, a portion of that cultural echo consistently maintained the seriousness. Morita had created a figure that was simultaneously dignified, humorous, and sorrowful. Despite his efforts to mold Miyagi's voice, Morita would still have to deal with a deeper irony. He was also stuck in ways he would never be able to fully get out of the role that salvaged his career. He never forgot such moments. The Karate Kid was more than simply a film to Pat Morita. After years of hardship, it was a pivotal moment, a second chance at life. Morita personally carried gentler memories from the set, moments that shaped his relationship with the cast and his personal path, while the rest of the world recalls the crane kick, the wax-on lessons, and Miyagi's calm wisdom. He would never forget these events. The night shoot for the famous drunk Miyagi scene was one of them. The studio wasn't sure if it should be included. Executives questioned whether viewers would put up with the sage mentor's vulnerability as he recalled losing his wife and child in an internment camp. Morita, however, battled for it. He gave the scene his all, stumbling through Miyagi's grief with a rawness that left the crew speechless. Later, Ralph Macchio recalled that nobody commented or applauded after the cameras stopped. They simply allowed Morita to remain silent. That evening proved to Pat that he was capable of more than just comedy. He had the power to bring people to tears. A smaller, less staged scene evoked another memory. The humor of using chopsticks to catch flies. Although the moment was intended to be lighthearted, Morita gave it a deeper meaning. His hands were steady, his eyes fixed on the impossible task, and he played it with an almost childish focus. Instead, when Daniel is successful, their chemistry explodes into real laughing. That small scene was so important to Morita that she loved it. Miyagi was more than just an educator. He was a man capable of surprise, competition, and laughter. For Morita, the friendship with Ralph Macchio was undoubtedly another treasured experience. When they were filming, Ralph was still a teenager, juggling the demands of celebrity and pressure, while Morita, who was considerably older, also had to play the role of offset protector. Both off-camera and on-camera, he imparted life lessons to Ralph through gentle humor and life experience. Years later, Macchio would call their relationship the film's heart, both on and off-screen. For Morita, their love was genuine and grew stronger each day they performed together. It wasn't staged. He also remembers how, over time, the crew's skepticism waned. Several of them had once questioned if the Happy Days comedian could perform the part. But as the days passed, Morita saw a shift. Even the stunt crew treated him with the kind of deference that only distinguished individuals receive by the time the tournament scenes were being recorded. In their view, he had transformed into a sensei, not only a performer portraying one. He carried that respect with him long after the filming was over. Similar to all the small customs Morita established in between takes, this one also involved adopting Miyagi's voice. Not for the camera. In this way, he kept himself grounded. In order to accumulate, he occasionally would improvisedly mumble counsel in bad English, partially in his own rhythm. They began to look for him, making a joke about Miyagi teaching them life lessons during a scene change. Morita treasured it because it demonstrated that Miyagi was more than just words. To everyone who approached him, he appeared alive. In retrospect, Morita would realize that the film's spirit was derived from all of the chemistry, stillness, and laughing. He knew that much. Forever would be the crane kick. However, he was interested in the friendships formed in the quiet areas of the set, which showed that something real had established itself behind the scenes of Hollywood. And as Pat Morita recalled these events near the end of his life, it became evident that Mr. Miyagi was more than simply a character. It truly was a gift that influenced him just as much as he did it. In a final thought, Pat realized that the Karate Kid had given him an opportunity that no other project had ever given him. The opportunity to be known as an artist who put his heart into a character that had an impact on the world, rather than as a comic who got lucky. Please hit like, leave a comment with your favorite Miyagi moment, and subscribe for more untold set stories if Pat Morita's own words altered your perception of the Karate Kid. For more behind-the-scenes information that performers only disclosed years later, watch the following video on your screen when you're ready.